The sky above Mexico City is heavy, shrouded in a sickly gray, as though the sun itself has given up trying to break through. There's an unnatural stillness in the air, a quiet that feels wrong, like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Beneath this ominous sky, the streets are empty, but for the occasional flicker of a streetlight struggling to stay alive. The pulse of the city is muffled, as though its heartbeat has slowed, subdued by an unseen force. You can feel it, can't you? That sense of unease, the way your skin prickles, the hairs on the back of your neck standing up as if they know something you don't. It's as if the very atmosphere is waiting for something, or someone, to break it, something that should have been left untouched, hidden away. A few miles away, in the heart of the city, a hospital sits like an island of normality in the midst of this oppressive silence. A quiet, unassuming building that, on most days, would house the faint echo of medical equipment and the whispers of doctors and nurses making their rounds. But tonight, it holds something far more sinister within its walls, something that, once exposed, will forever change the course of history. This was supposed to be a place of healing. But instead, it became the origin of a catastrophe, a story of theft, greed, and disaster. And in the end, it was a story of the most silent of killers, radiation. How far would you go to uncover the truth? To dig into the shadows of history and confront the horrors that lie buried beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when they will resurface. Because tonight, we will take you on a journey into the unknown, a story that has haunted Mexico for decades, a story of deadly consequences that no one could have anticipated. It was the year 1983 when a Cobalt-60 teletherapy unit was stolen from a medical facility in Mexico City, and that moment would forever alter the course of so many lives. To most, it was an ordinary medical machine, a piece of equipment designed to save lives by using radioactive material to treat cancer. But to the thieves who targeted it, it was nothing more than another object to be sold for profit. They didn't know, couldn't know, what they were dealing with. The dangers of Cobalt-60 weren't visible to the naked eye. There was no warning sign on the machine that said, "Do not touch. Do not steal. This could kill you." It was just a machine, abandoned and unguarded in a hospital's basement, its deadly potential hidden behind its metal frame. That is, until the night the thieves took it. They broke into the hospital, slipping through the back entrance under the cover of darkness. No one saw them enter. No one heard them dismantle the unit, stripping away its metal casing to reveal the core of it, the Cobalt-60, a radioactive substance with the power to destroy life itself. And still, they didn't understand. They didn't know that by taking it, they were unleashing a disaster that would ripple far beyond the walls of that hospital. They sold the machine to scrap metal dealers, unaware of the deadly cargo it carried. These dealers, too, had no idea what they were holding. They didn't realize they were handling a material that could cause invisible, silent harm, radiation poisoning that could make a person feel sick and weak, or worse, take away their lives. From there, it only escalated. The stolen Cobalt-60 made its way into the hands of unsuspecting buyers who turned the stolen metal into construction materials. Workers were unaware of the dangers lurking in their hands. Builders unknowingly incorporated the contaminated metal into buildings. Those same workers and civilians would soon experience strange, terrifying symptoms, nausea, fatigue, and hair loss. People would die, but the cause would be unclear, masked by the everyday symptoms of disease and accident. There would be no obvious connection between these strange deaths and the stolen Cobalt-60, and the horror would slowly grow, unnoticed, until it was too late. But that's the thing about these kinds of stories, isn't it? The moment when everything begins to unravel, when the truth starts to seep through the cracks, it's almost always too late to do anything about it. The damage is done. The pieces are scattered, the victims have been exposed, and the shadows are already spreading. And so, the mystery begins, not with a bang, not with an explosion of chaos, but with a quiet, unseen force slowly working its way into the fabric of society. A silent killer, one that moves undetected, spreading its poison through the air, through the soil, through the very buildings people live and work in. This is the beginning of the story of Cobalt-60 in Mexico, a story that stretches beyond the boundaries of the material world and into something darker, something more sinister. And in the end, the question remains, was this just a horrific accident, or is there something more at play here? Something beyond comprehension, something supernatural, something that hides in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Now, as we walk together through the corridors of history, remember one thing: the darkness doesn't just hide in the night. Sometimes, it hides in the most unsuspecting places, in the very things we take for granted, in the objects we handle every day. And sometimes, it's the smallest, quietest moments that set the stage for the greatest horrors to come. To truly understand the terror unleashed by the theft of Cobalt-60, we must go back to the beginning, before the shadows grew long, before the whispers in the dark began to spread. This story doesn't begin with the thieves or even with the stolen materials. It begins much earlier, with the technology itself, and the years of scientific progress that led to it. In the mid-20th century, the world was in the throes of the atomic age. The horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki still echoed through history, and the promises of radiation, of harnessing the very power of the atom, held both hope and terror in equal measure. Radiation could cure, but it could also destroy. It could heal, but it could also kill. And in the hands of medical professionals, it was used to treat cancers, to fight disease with the very force that had caused so much suffering just years before. In 1956, Mexico's National Institute of Cancerology, INCAN, was one of the first institutions in Latin America to adopt cutting-edge technology for treating cancer patients. The Cobalt-60 teletherapy unit, used in radiation therapy, was a vital part of their arsenal against cancer. The radioactive material inside, Cobalt-60, was a powerful isotope with a half-life of about 5 years, meaning it would continue emitting deadly radiation for years to come. Doctors, researchers, and medical staff were all aware of its dangers, of course. Strict safety protocols were put in place, and it was stored in specially designed lead containers to prevent any accidental exposure. But even with all of this technology, even with all the care taken to handle Cobalt-60 properly, the reality is that human error, or worse, human malice, could still lead to disastrous consequences. What seemed like an invaluable medical tool, a breakthrough in cancer treatment, was also a ticking time bomb, a powerful, invisible force that could slip through the cracks of safety measures. By the early 1980s, the teletherapy unit in question had been used for several years to treat patients, successfully saving many lives. But it also held within it a latent danger, one that, at the time, was invisible to the naked eye. The Cobalt-60 inside the unit, though carefully regulated, was an object of potential disaster if mishandled. But no one knew that it would be stolen, removed from the safe confines of the hospital, and transformed into something far more deadly, something that would wreak havoc across Mexico for years to come. In 1983, as the world was growing increasingly more aware of the potential dangers of radioactive materials, Mexico had just begun to put new regulations in place to prevent such things from happening. The government had started to enforce stricter controls over radioactive substances, and monitoring systems had been put into place. But despite these efforts, the theft of the Cobalt-60 unit went unnoticed for days, even weeks, after it was taken. In a city like Mexico City, teeming with life, with its sprawling neighborhoods, bustling markets, and crowded streets, who would notice the disappearance of a small medical unit, sitting quietly in a hospital basement? No one had thought to check the storage room where the teletherapy unit had been kept, not until it was too late. And by then, the thieves had already made their way out of the hospital with the precious cargo. These criminals, these thieves, had no idea what they were dealing with. All they saw was a machine that they could sell for scrap. They didn't understand the radioactive substance inside, the danger that lurked just beneath its surface. The Cobalt-60 wasn't just any metal, it was the material responsible for a series of deaths, illnesses, and an ongoing crisis that would take years to resolve. The thieves sold the unit to a scrap metal dealer, an act that set off a chain of events with consequences no one could have predicted. And even then, the stolen Cobalt-60 remained just another forgotten piece of machinery, until it found its way into the hands of people who would use it without question, without understanding. It was a deadly gamble that no one had ever intended to play. And so, the radiation, invisible and undetectable, made its way into the hands of innocent people. Those who worked with the metal were unaware that they were now handling an agent of death, a substance capable of rendering their bodies fragile and weak, to the point of decay. The tale of the Cobalt-60 theft quickly evolved from a simple story of criminal negligence to a dark mystery, a question that would hang in the air like a thick fog, waiting to be unraveled. The metal, now in the hands of scrap dealers and construction workers, found its way into the most unlikely places, into new homes, into buildings, into schools. And as it spread, so did the sickness. People began to show up at hospitals with strange, unexplainable symptoms. Nausea, vomiting, weakness, hair loss, and, in the most tragic cases, death. But it was still impossible to trace the cause. People couldn't understand. How could something so ordinary, an object as simple as a piece of metal, cause so much harm? At the time, medical professionals were unaware of the true cause of these mysterious deaths. They had no idea that Cobalt-60 had been stolen and was now buried in the walls of their own city. And so, the story continued to unfold, slowly, agonizingly, with no one yet realizing the full scope of the disaster. As the Cobalt-60 continued its silent journey through Mexico's streets and buildings, the damage it would cause remained hidden, locked away in the walls of the city, within the very structures meant to protect and shelter. The consequences were far more insidious than anyone could have imagined, an invisible plague, spreading its poison without warning. It wasn't until months later that the first signs of something truly strange began to surface. The first case was reported in a hospital on the outskirts of Mexico City. A construction worker, suffering from severe nausea and intense fatigue, was brought in by his family. He was in his mid-30s, young, healthy, and otherwise without any prior health issues. The doctors were baffled. His blood work was normal. There were no signs of a virus, no clear indication of what was wrong. And yet, this man's body was deteriorating, visibly weakening with each passing day. Within weeks, he was dead. His family was left to mourn a man who had been vibrant and full of life just days before. His death, though tragic, was written off as a sudden illness, an unfortunate case of undiagnosed disease. But this wasn't an isolated incident. More cases followed, and soon, doctors and medical personnel started to notice the unsettling patterns. Similar cases of unexplained sickness were being reported in the area. Workers from various construction sites were falling ill, some rapidly deteriorating with symptoms that couldn't be explained. It was as though their bodies were shutting down in a way that defied reason: nausea, hair loss, sudden weight loss, and eventually, organ failure. It wasn't until one doctor, Dr. Manuel Valdez, took a closer look at the growing number of unexplained deaths that the chilling pattern began to emerge. Dr. Valdez was an experienced oncologist, specializing in cancer treatment. His specialty, however, was the very type of radiation therapy that Cobalt-60 powered. The odd deaths in construction workers piqued his curiosity. At first, he thought nothing of it: accidents, viruses, or perhaps a new strain of illness. But the frequency of the deaths raised alarms. He knew radiation could be deadly. He had seen the effects of overexposure during his career, but never before had he seen this kind of rapid, indiscriminate destruction. Dr. Valdez began to dig deeper. His investigations led him to the scrap metal dealers who had unknowingly handled the stolen Cobalt-60. After a few discreet inquiries, it became clear that the teletherapy unit had been sold, likely broken down into smaller pieces and dispersed into construction materials. His worst fear was confirmed: the Cobalt-60 was everywhere. It was in the walls of newly constructed homes, in schools, and in the very places where people had gathered to live and work, believing them to be safe. What had started as a simple theft, a criminal act that seemed trivial, had turned into something far more dangerous. What Dr. Valdez was uncovering wasn't just a medical disaster, it was a mystery that raised even darker questions. Was this a case of ignorance, or had someone, or something, purposefully unleashed this radiation on the people of Mexico? The scale of the contamination was unlike anything seen before. The metal had found its way into the very fabric of the city, becoming embedded in its infrastructure, in its bones. The walls of newly built buildings now held the deadly Cobalt-60, each particle of metal a silent, deadly bomb waiting to trigger its effects. And it wasn't just the workers who had been exposed. Entire families were unknowingly living and working in contaminated areas, suffering silently as their bodies broke down, their cells destroyed by the invisible radiation. In the face of this disaster, authorities were slow to act. Many of the officials had no idea what to make of the situation. At first, the death toll was so small that it could be written off as an accident. But as the cases continued to mount, the truth could no longer be ignored. The source of the radiation was a mystery that no one could solve, not for a long time. Dr. Valdez went public with his findings, but the government was hesitant to address the situation. The truth, as it turned out, was more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The Cobalt-60 wasn't just another piece of stolen equipment, it was part of a massive, systemic failure, one that reached far beyond the theft itself. It was a story of negligence and corruption, of shortcuts taken, and of an unthinkable failure in safety protocols. And it was a story of the sheer recklessness of those who failed to understand the power they were dealing with. Still, the most chilling question remained unanswered: who was ultimately responsible for this disaster? Was it simply a tragic mistake, or was it a deliberate act to cause harm? Was there an unseen hand that orchestrated this chain of events, or was it merely a case of human greed and ignorance? As Dr. Valdez continued to piece together the fragments of the mystery, he began to suspect that something more insidious might be at play. Was there someone, or something, who had planned the theft of the Cobalt-60, fully aware of the destruction it would cause? And if so, who could possibly gain from such a catastrophe? The more he uncovered, the more the lines between human malice and dark forces began to blur, leaving only confusion and fear in their wake. You've made it this far, and that means you're as obsessed with uncovering the unknown as we are. The mystery of Cobalt-60 is far from over, and we still don't know the full extent of the danger it unleashed. But we want to hear your theories. Did the stolen Cobalt-60 cause all the suffering? Or is something else at play here? Was there a deeper, darker force at work? Let us know your thoughts by hitting like, subscribe, and comment below. We'll dive into your theories in the next part of this chilling investigation. As the cases continued to pile up, the true scale of the Cobalt-60 contamination became undeniable. But as devastating as these deaths were, they raised even more unsettling questions, questions that could only be answered by the sharpest scientific minds. Could modern technology help uncover the source of the radiation, and could it offer any hope for the people exposed to it? In the midst of the chaos, a team of scientists, led by Dr. Valdez, began to examine the contamination using advanced methods to trace the path of the stolen Cobalt-60. They turned to technology, the very kind of high-tech equipment that had been used to detect radiation in military applications and space exploration. They knew that finding the source of the radiation was critical to understanding how far the disaster had spread, and how many innocent lives were at risk. Their first step was to use satellite scans, advanced imaging technology designed to detect anomalies beneath the Earth's surface. These scans, typically used in geological studies and archaeological digs, were repurposed to scan the very city that had been affected by the Cobalt-60 theft. What they discovered was shocking: patches of radiation exposure that seemed to follow a peculiar pattern, as if the radiation had bled into the Earth itself, subtly but relentlessly spreading throughout the area. The scans revealed concentrations of Cobalt-60 not just in the immediate vicinity of the construction sites, but across other districts of Mexico City. But it wasn't just isolated pockets of contamination. These radiation hotspots were increasingly widespread, indicating that the metal had been incorporated into a vast number of buildings. The engineers who had built these structures had unknowingly crafted homes and schools with radioactive material buried in their walls and foundations. What they thought were innocuous materials for construction were now lethal time bombs. Satellite images revealed areas where the contamination was especially high, construction zones that had expanded rapidly in the years after the theft. It was no coincidence. The thieves had sold the Cobalt-60 to scrap metal dealers, who had unknowingly mixed it into building materials, steel beams, concrete, even the rebar. The seemingly innocent construction projects had become the epicenter of a public health crisis. But these scans weren't the only technological methods being employed. Dr. Valdez's team also turned to highly sensitive radiation detectors, devices used by nuclear inspectors to measure minute levels of radiation in the environment. The detectors were placed in neighborhoods, schools, and hospitals, in an effort to map out areas of contamination. As the detectors were strategically placed in various locations, they started to detect unusual readings. Some of these readings were off the charts, indicating an unusually high amount of radiation, especially in areas where children played or people gathered. In one particular school, located just outside the epicenter of the construction zone, a detector registered radiation levels far higher than what was considered safe. Children, who spent hours each day in classrooms and playgrounds, had unknowingly been exposed to a deadly, invisible force. The numbers told a harrowing story. The radiation levels were 200 times higher than the average level found in other areas of the city. The troubling readings didn't stop there. Using specialized tools, researchers were able to conduct soil samples, which revealed that Cobalt-60 had been absorbed into the soil, creating radioactive hotspots that were even more difficult to trace. The radioactive isotopes had settled into the earth, contaminating everything it touched, from the buildings to the plants, to the air itself. What had started as an accidental theft had turned into a massive environmental catastrophe that could potentially affect generations to come. But there was something even more disturbing at play. The Cobalt-60 used in medical treatments was a specific isotope, one that emitted gamma radiation, which could penetrate deep into living tissue, causing cell damage at a microscopic level. And when exposed to the body, gamma radiation had the potential to cause cancer, tissue necrosis, and eventually, organ failure. The victims, who had been exposed to even small amounts of radiation, would have experienced the symptoms gradually: nausea, hair loss, extreme fatigue. By the time they realized what was happening, it was often too late. As the team continued their work, they discovered something even stranger: a number of unexpected anomalies. The radiation from the stolen Cobalt-60 didn't behave like typical radiation. It wasn't confined to a single source, nor did it dissipate in predictable patterns. Some areas experienced spikes in radiation levels, followed by sudden drops, as if the source itself were shifting, almost intentionally, like a shadow slipping in and out of view. In the most contaminated areas, people began reporting strange phenomena: electrical disturbances, lights flickering inexplicably, machinery malfunctioning without warning. Was it possible that the radiation was somehow affecting not just biological systems but the very technology around it, warping the laws of physics itself? In some cases, researchers even began to wonder if there was more to this than just a stolen machine. Was it possible that the Cobalt-60 had been intentionally misused, or had it somehow transformed into something more dangerous than its original form? The Cobalt-60 was only supposed to be a source of controlled radiation, nothing more. But its current state, dispersed across the city and seeping into everyday life, suggested something far more sinister. The technological investigations had only just begun, and what they were uncovering suggested that there were far more layers to this story than anyone could have predicted. Was the Cobalt-60 theft part of a much larger conspiracy, one that involved more than just criminals? Or was it a natural disaster, the result of a tragic mistake, compounded by the widespread negligence of the authorities and the very systems meant to protect the public? As the scientific team made groundbreaking discoveries, the true human cost of the Cobalt-60 disaster began to unfold. It was one thing to analyze data and radiation levels, but it was something entirely different to hear the voices of those directly affected by the contamination. The true horror of the story wasn't just the unknown, it was the faces of the victims, the families who would never be the same, and the lives lost to an invisible force. One of the first witnesses to speak out was Rosario Velasquez, a mother who had lived in one of the most heavily contaminated areas in Mexico City. She was a school teacher, and for years, she had devoted herself to the children in her care. But after the contamination was discovered, Rosario became one of the leading voices in the fight for justice for the victims. I started to notice something was wrong around 2001, Rosario recalled in a trembling voice. I had headaches that wouldn't go away, and I was always tired. At first, I thought it was stress, the usual things, but then I started hearing about others around me, teachers, students, who were feeling the same way. Her story mirrored that of countless others in the city. At first, the symptoms were subtle: fatigue, headaches, and general malaise. But then, things began to escalate. Rosario's hair began to thin. Her skin turned a sickly shade of yellow, and her once vibrant energy was drained. I didn't realize what was happening to me. It wasn't until the doctors ran tests and told me I had been exposed to radiation that I understood. But by then, it was too late. Rosario wasn't the only one. Among the first group of children exposed to Cobalt-60, many began to show alarming signs of illness. One of the most tragic stories came from a young girl named Ana Maria, who had attended school in one of the affected districts. The symptoms came on slowly at first. Ana Maria, a cheerful 8-year-old, had always been full of life, until one fateful day when her skin began to show signs of bruising and discoloration. Her family was baffled and rushed her to the hospital, where doctors ran several tests. It wasn't long before they confirmed what they had feared: Ana Maria's cells were being damaged by radiation. The doctors suspected that the young girl's exposure had come from the very walls of her school, which had unknowingly been constructed using contaminated materials. Ana Maria's family struggled to comprehend how this could happen, how a school, meant to protect and nurture children, had become a silent death trap. The pain of seeing her once bubbly daughter in and out of hospitals was overwhelming for her parents, but it was nothing compared to the devastating news that Ana Maria's prognosis was grim. The radiation had caused severe organ damage, and she didn't have long to live. Her story wasn't isolated. Dozens of children, many of them who had played in the same schoolyard, breathing in the air thick with invisible toxins, fell ill with similar symptoms. The emotional toll on parents who had watched their children go from healthy to gravely ill in a matter of months was immeasurable. Even as doctors and authorities scrambled to understand the extent of the contamination, many families were left in the dark. The government's response was slow, and for many, there was no one to turn to. Rosario, Ana Maria's parents, and others like them had to fight tirelessly just to get answers. Many of these families spoke of their despair in interviews with news outlets and advocacy groups. They described feeling betrayed, not just by the criminals who had caused this devastation, but by the government and construction companies who had failed to properly investigate the origins of the materials used in their homes and schools. Even when evidence surfaced about the stolen Cobalt-60, the response was far too slow. The families' calls for justice echoed through the streets, but it seemed as though they were being ignored. Yet, the human stories didn't stop at the victims themselves. Investigators, too, were deeply affected by the catastrophe. Dr. Valdez, the lead scientist studying the contamination, spoke candidly about how the discovery haunted him. At first, I saw it as just another scientific mystery to solve, he said in a quiet voice during one of his interviews. But as I began speaking to the families, seeing the children in those hospitals, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't just a case of faulty materials. It was something much darker. We were dealing with lives, real people who had been sacrificed to something beyond their control. For Dr. Valdez, the investigation turned personal. In his efforts to understand the cause of the radiation leak, he found himself immersed in a battle against not just bureaucracy and corporate negligence, but his own sense of guilt. He had been part of the scientific community that used Cobalt-60 in medical treatments, and the idea that the material had been stolen and mishandled haunted him. I thought we were doing good with the technology, he admitted. We were using it to cure cancer, to save lives. I never imagined that something meant to heal could turn into this. The emotional toll on the investigators was just as real. They found themselves grappling with the weight of responsibility as the magnitude of the disaster became clearer. Some began to question the role of modern technology in the world. Had they been complicit in creating the very danger they were now fighting to contain? And could any of them, even with all their scientific knowledge, reverse the damage already done? In one particularly haunting account, an investigator named Luis Hernandez, who had worked with Dr. Valdez, confessed to the toll the case had taken on his mental health. "There's a part of me that wonders if we'll ever know the full story," he said, his eyes heavy with fatigue. "The radiation is still out there, and we're still uncovering the effects. But what if it's already too late?" These were the questions that hung in the air as the investigation continued. The Cobalt-60 catastrophe wasn't just a scientific anomaly, it was a human tragedy. And for those involved, the lingering question remained, could they ever undo the harm that had been done, or was this a wound too deep to heal? As the investigation reached its conclusion, one thing became clear: the Cobalt-60 disaster was more than just a case of human negligence. It was a reflection of a much darker reality, a hidden truth that had been buried beneath the surface for far too long. The contamination had touched so many lives, and yet the full scope of the damage was still unknown. Authorities had made efforts to contain the fallout, but no one could erase the suffering that had already been inflicted on the victims, nor could they undo the loss that had rippled through the city. For Rosario, Ana Maria's parents, and countless other families, there was no closure. The contamination was still there, silently haunting the streets, the homes, the schools. The authorities had promised to decontaminate the affected areas, but many residents knew that the scars of radiation wouldn't disappear so easily. In the end, what could be done? Was the Cobalt-60 theft truly an accident, or was it part of something much more calculated? Was there someone behind the scenes, orchestrating the chaos for profit, or even something more sinister? Questions swirled, unanswered, as the investigation ended, but the lingering feeling was unmistakable. The Cobalt-60 disaster had not only exposed a system failure, it had unearthed a deeper, more insidious truth about the fragility of human life, the dangers of unchecked power, and the vulnerability of society itself. As Dr. Valdez looked over the final reports and scientific data, his thoughts turned to the future. We can study the contamination. We can gather evidence. But there's no guarantee that we'll ever have the answers we seek, he admitted, the weight of the tragedy heavy in his voice. The Cobalt-60 might have been stolen, but there's still something else in the shadows, something we might never understand. The story of Cobalt-60 in Mexico was far from over. It wasn't just about a stolen teletherapy machine, a series of deaths, or a few contaminated buildings. It was about something much deeper, a mystery that was never meant to be solved, a truth that remained just out of reach, forever evading the light. As the camera pulled back from the scientist's office, the streets of Mexico City seemed eerily calm, as if life were continuing as usual. But those who knew the full story understood that there was something dark lingering beneath the surface, a poison that no amount of decontamination could wash away. And so, the mystery of the Cobalt-60 theft remains unsolved, an enigma that will haunt the streets of Mexico City for generations to come. Was it simply the result of greed, or was there something far more insidious at work? Could the Cobalt-60 be part of a larger, hidden conspiracy, one that reaches far beyond this tragic incident? The answers may never come. But one thing is certain, this story is far from over. And as long as the shadows remain, the whispers will continue.